Hello and welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Author Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is taking care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. You can check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. Books are available through our bookstore ampersand books. I'll put the link in the chat. We're so excited to have Jeannine Ouellette with us this evening. First, we'll hear her reader selection, then she'll be in conversation with Gina Frangello. Gina Frangello is the author of 4 books of fiction in addition to the memoir, Blow Your House Down, a story of family, feminism, and treason. Her most recent novel, Every Kind of Wanting, was included in several best of lists for 2016, including Chicago magazines and the Chicago Review of Books. Jeannine Ouellette's work has appeared widely in journals, including the North American Review, Narrative, Calyx, Writer's Chronicle, and December, and in the anthologies Misaligned, Women Writing About Men, Nowhere Print Annual, Women's Lives, Multicultural Perspectives, and Feminist Parenting. Her stories and essays have won recognition from Narrative Story Contest and Masters Review Fiction Contest, among other awards. She teaches at the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop, University of Minnesota, and Elephant Rock, the independent writing program she founded in 2012. Her memoir, The Part That Burns, is a story about the tenacity of family roots, the formidable undertow of trauma, and the rebellious and persistent yearning of human beings for love for each other. Jeannine, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan, and Writers and Books. And thank you, Gina, for being here.
I'm so happy to see your face again.
Me too. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. And thanks everyone, who's here tonight to listen.
Thank you.
Are you ready for me to take it away, Dan?
Yeah, it's all you.
It's on me. Okay. I'll be reading tonight from The Part That Burns, and I'll be reading an excerpt from the title chapter, The Part That Burns. I think there might be a couple of people here out there in the audience. I'm not sure, but I think there might be a couple of people here who got to hear from The Part That Burns over the weekend at Hippocamp, the Creative Nonfiction Conference, the one and only in-person event that I've done for this memoir since it was published in February. So it was pretty thrilling. And I'm going to pick up right where that reading left off tonight. So what's going on at this moment in the story is that the narrator is 9 months pregnant with her second child, and she's just had an argument during which she and her mother speak openly for the first time about the sexual abuse that the narrator suffered by her stepfather, whose nickname is Mafia. And the mother reveals during this argument that she knew about the abuse all along, even when the narrator was a very small child. Then the mother gets overwhelmed by emotion, which she presents as rage, and she storms out of the narrator's house. And meanwhile, the narrator has been during her pregnancy obsessing over this garden in her side yard. It's a garden she tried to plant from seed, but it quickly became overgrown and out of control because she didn't know how to tend a garden or how to tell a seedling flower from a weed. So this is where we're picking up, just as the narrator's mother has stormed out the door. I have a sea of rage in me, also a baby. I can reconcile neither. My mother is an old 44, dried up and sexless, a crone, like in the fairy tales I read to Sophie. Who believes anymore that a crone can be a fairy in disguise? I'd like to see this magic. A crone is just a crone, and I don't ever want to be one. But I'm afraid that in some fundamental way, I already am one and always will be. Here's what Mom says about her own mother, Grandma Krause. Grandma Krause expected my mother to be a boy with how low she was carrying. Any lower, I'd be dragging this child on the sidewalk, Grandma Krause liked to say in her last agonizing weeks of pregnancy. When, instead of a boy, my mother squawked into the world, Grandma Krause was disappointed. To console herself, Grandma Krause named my mother Georgianne and called her George, the same name she'd planned for the son who didn't come. George, the name of my mother's father and grandfather. My mother's Smithville home was a squat, clapboard farmhouse in a field on the edges of Duluth. I never asked if the chickens that lived upstairs in winter had dominion over the whole second floor. Mom only talked about the squawking and the shit. Details make the legend, and legend forms its own truth. Another legend, though this could be wrong too, is how once during an overnight bender, Mom's uncles burned down the outhouse. So when she trudged across the sopping grass the next morning, all Mom found to piss in was a hole in the ground and a pile of ash. What I know for sure, though, is that Grandma and Grandpa Krause were both dead by the time Mom turned 17, when she got pregnant and married my father. Then, the party on Park Point. Here's how I imagine that thick summer night. Mom was 18 and smoking True Blues, teased hair sprayed stiff, coral candy lipstick to match her dress. My father was a young James Dean, tight Levi's and leather jacket, hair slicked back with Brill cream. I was up the hill in the West End at Aunt Flossie's. Mom had roped her younger sister into babysitting. Maybe I was asleep, maybe crying, maybe gazing at Flossie with my watery newborn eyes, wise and floating. I was still easy then. Park Point is a narrow 7-mile sand spit across the metal lift bridge from Duluth's working harbor. Stretching south from the port of Duluth, the point divides the mean waters of Lake Superior from Superior Bay and the Duluth Harbor Basin. Later, my mother would tell me how the beach shack shook that night as bodies packed in by the dozen, everyone smoking and drinking and shouting over each other and over the songs that poured from the record player, Hey Jude and Mrs. Robinson and Sunshine of Your Love. Fumes from the hardboard processing plant across the bay filled the air. Above the lake, a flat disk of moon hung like a nickel, slicing open the black water with a sharp tunnel of light. In the house, faces shone and t-shirts clung damp across chests and underarms. Mom sat on the green brocade couch in the postage stamp living room, her long legs crossed at the knee, the last of her cigarette in one hand, a warm beer in the other, her two best friends on either side of her, also smoking and drinking. Mom's cheeks, round and high, glowed with alcohol and summer, glowed with sex. But her lazy eye went loose. The patch she'd worn as a child from her amblyopia had never corrected the problem completely, as she watched her young husband holding court in the Harvest Gold kitchen. He was telling his best story Mom could see, the one about his motorcycle accident on Skyline Parkway. It was obvious in the way he waved his arms and hands, indicating the road ahead, indicating the rain, the oncoming car. It was also evident in how the women's lips parted, how their eyes softened with want. Mom clenched her jaw, but wait, he had married her, hadn't he? She sucked in her stomach, still fleshy from me, and yanked at her thick bra straps to hoist up her breasts, hard as rocks and hot with milk. Christ, though, she wanted more. The friend on Mom's right leaned in, pointed toward my father, whispered something pungent with beer and tobacco into Mom's ear. Mom threw her head back and laughed, tapped her cigarette and watched the long, soft snake of ash fall to the floor. Then, enormous hollow boom and blinding light. Bodies and furniture rose weightlessly above the ball of fire as windows blew out and the walls collapsed in 4 directions, falling out like playing cards. The pitched roof billowed up 50 feet closer to the moon before crashing to the ground. A gas line had busted under the floorboards. Mom's two best friends died instantly, while Mom was thrown a dozen feet from the house before landing like a cloth doll on the dirt, shoulder ripped from socket, ear dangling from scalp. We thought she had died, Aunt Flossie always said. Too many people jumping up and down is how Mom always told it. She flicked a cigarette, my dad continued to say. So many years later, it seemed cruel, really, to blame Mom still. Several people were killed in that explosion. As the house burned, flashing lights flooded the sandbar in red and blue. Sirens howled across the water as squads and fire trucks and ambulances rushed to find the house already reduced to blackened sticks. My father, unhurt, watched it smolder. The brain is an extremely fragile organ made up of delicate, soft tissue that floats inside the skull. The severity and permanence of injury to the brain depend on the degree or extent of damage. Specific scale scores should always be used to measure damage in order to determine the right treatment. Treatment should begin as soon as possible and continue as long as necessary. Should is a slippery word. My mother's ear was sewn back on, her shoulder pinned together. This is all we know. I march out the porch door to my side garden, Sophie beside me, her blanket in one hand and my ratty childhood doll Burnett in the other. I named Burnett when I was 4 after my favorite TV star, Carol Burnett. I first called the doll Carol, but my cousin said that was boring. Now Sophie mothers Burnett with a ferocious brand of love, as if seeking to reform a defiant new recruit. It's comical, really, the strictness of Sophie's doll discipline, when I myself struggle with setting any limits at all. No, 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 Sophie yells, do not touch. While Sophie instructs Burnett, I bend over as best I can to pull, claw, yank, and tear at all the ugly stuff I can find. It's demanding work, and at some point I begin to groan. Sophie stops mid-tirade. Mama owie, she says, her face clouding with worry. No, honey, I say. Mama's just reading. Sophie resumes her scolding of Burnett. No biting, she says. Then, in a conspiratorial whisper, I bite Mama. When Sophie eventually fusses, I ferry her back inside for bath and jammies and toothbrushing. I tell another story of the Isthmus people, this time a good witch in a house tucked so neatly behind another we have never even noticed it. That house is frozen, I say, tucking Sophie's ringlets behind her ear, tracing the soft hollow of her temple. It's covered in icicles always, even in summer. And because of the way the ice sparkles and because the house is so close to the water, it looks like a diamond floating away on the waves. Blessedly, Sophie falls asleep before I do, no biting at all. And I head straight back to my garden. The sky's not dark yet, but the moon dangles high above the lake, a small bright thing, barely half of itself. It is either, what is that called? Waxing or waning. I have no idea. This garden too is half of what it was before I began weeding, yet also somehow more, I think, as my pile of ripped up quackgrass and dandelions grows satisfyingly large. Apparently, some weeds are obvious, even to me. Mom was orphaned at 17. Chickens lived in her house. Mafia beat her in front of me. These are facts, but I don't know what they mean to me or to myself. Cognition refers to thinking, but thought takes many forms. Before I dropped out of college, I took 2 years of Latin. In that language, cognoscere means not only to know, but to learn, inquire, experience. I tear harder at the overgrowth, wrenching at whatever I find, ropey stems and prickly leaves. I attack until my palms blister, my back and hips ache, my knees carve divots into the ground. This work is addictive, a trance of never-ending elimination. Demolition is like that. It sucks you in, it swallows. By the time I rise to assess the emptiness I've carved, I recognize the fire between my hips and ribs as more than gardening. This baby is on the way. Guess what, sweetie, you're almost there. This is what the nurse says when she examines me. Her hands are warm and gentle. Just a skip and a jump, hun. She pats my shoulder and grins. Maybe I'm not a very good feminist for liking how she calls me sweetie and hun, but I do like it very much. Hit the buzzer when things pick up, the nurse says as she leaves. John feeds me ice chips as I ride cascading waves of pain. This homey country birthing room is a far cry from the high-tech city hospital where Sophie was born, where I was hooked up to a monitor and Pitocin, where a male doctor I'd never met sliced me open to make pushing go faster. I'm happy here in this sleepy, low-lit place, laboring in my own way with my raspberry leaf tea and some black cohosh to speed things along. Before dawn, my water breaks with a gush. I vomit. Atta girl, John says happily. He remembers this turning point from Sophie's birth. He laughs, his real laugh. We whisper together between contractions until it comes the fiercest wave yet. Here is the nurse again, now the doctor. My body seizes and rolls through the shocks that follow, and I stare into the void behind my closed eyes, entranced by the giant weeds coming up through the darkness, one after the next, rhythmic and ghostly, white roots intact, wet dirt clinging to fine-haired tendrils. Visualize your cervix opening, the baby moving through you, the nurse says. I try to think of Jackson Street, those roses opening petal by petal, but I see only weeds pulled up by the root, one after the other, until something else finally pushes its way through the darkness too. Something fiery that slides back into myself. This is my body, filling my body. Into this vision, weeds drawn from fertile soil over and over again, weeds and the rich, heady smell of dirt, weeds and the awkward act of pulling life from life, life into life, one thing to die and another to live. My son is born. This boy is neither flower nor weed. He doesn't come from the earth. He comes from me. The part that burns is the part that glows. My body is bigger than my body. My body is a nebula, hydrogen and helium, dust and plasma. Bodies are made of cells. Cells are made of atoms, and atoms are billions of years old. My son is slick against my naked chest. His skin is the exact same temperature as mine. His tiny bones are soft and alive. His mouth is a mouth searching for home, and home is the stellar nursery of my skin, my breath. Hello, baby, I say. His gray eyes float through light years to fix on this I realize is a covenant. Waning moon, John says, pointing out the hospital window. Now I know, but it doesn't matter because soon enough the moon will wax again. Not everything that leaves comes back though. I don't know what will become of my mother or the woman who moans or me or John or Mafia or any of us. I think of the yard squirrels Sophie has named Carl and Sugar, their blurry, anonymous squirrel bodies always running. I still don't know what it means, but here's what I do know. I am a moon and Sophie fits into my hollows, no matter the shape I take, and so too must my son. Look at you, I whisper. His name will be Maxwell for deep water. You need to push, hun, the nurse says. The placenta is still inside me, this temporary organ formed from the same bundle of cells that also became this tiny creature in my arms, who is now studying my face like a familiar constellation. In some cultures, the placenta is called the twin. In this rural hospital, it's just a placenta. Still, I'll be allowed to take it home where I'll bury it in my garden to decompose into simple matter and begin again. Scientists say our cells hold everything forever, but Cells are constantly dying and regenerating. Sometimes cellular regeneration hurts, but not always. The body replaces itself with an almost entirely new set of cells every 7 to 10 years. Some important parts are renewed even faster. Other important parts are never renewed. All these facts are true. Push, the nurse says again. You have to push. She presses hard on my stomach with one hand, a graphic kind of pain, and strokes my forehead with the other, which makes me cry. You can do this, she says. Just push. So I do. I push. Thank you. Gina, you're muted.
I'm muted. I have to get out of my car. Here I am back in my house. Yeah, it was so wonderful, Jeannine. I never get tired of hearing you read from this book. It's just, I think, one of the best books of the year. I've been shouting it from the rooftops. I am taken so often by your treatment of your mom in the book, and then your identity as a mother, of course, as well. And I wanted to actually throw out a question to you. I saw a friend recently post on Facebook on her page that, you know, when women have done us wrong, when women have hurt us, etc., like, go and think about the way that they've been hurt by men. And while I found obviously some truth to that, I also thought about personal responsibility and accountability. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your mother's life and the pains that she suffered, and how you integrate that into your feelings about her now with regard to the things that she allowed to happen to you and expressed as rage instead of as empathy.
Ooh, that's a big one. Well, first of all, that's you know, that's an interesting Facebook post that you just referred to. I haven't seen that, but you know, we've all been told, like, think about when someone's behaving badly, you know, what happened to them earlier that day, or some version of that. And I think that it's like everything else, that there's truth in, I think, you know, that it's just not, nothing is, very few things are black and white. And I think both of these sentiments that you're raising are true, that, you know, the friend's post is true. And I think it's why it felt important to me to explore my mom's backstory in the book, both from sort of an ethical, you know, perspective, and also from an artistic perspective, because I think any reader, certainly I would be saying to myself, how could someone behave in this way? Why? You know, like, just the question of why. And when I teach writing, I always teach curiosity as the root of empathy, you know, so just this, that if we're not asking why, you know, as the writer, you know, why, I, you know, kind of in the George Saunders school of fiction, just to really want to understand what's behind the facade of every character, even the real ones. So that was important to me. And that said, I do agree with you that we are accountable, you know, for the choices that we make. And, you know, I have a relationship with my mom, as do my sisters. I see certainly the ways in which the choices that she has made have affected, you know, the relationships that she has in her adult life. It's just a fact. I don't think, you know, like, I don't think my mom is here tonight listening, you know, but if she were, I feel like I would say the same with myself. The choices that I have made in my adult life, you know, affect the quality of my relationships and will affect those relationships years from now. That's just a truth that we all live with, you know? And so forgiveness, if, you know, forgiveness is complicated. I don't really know where I am on that continuum of forgiveness, but it doesn't erase. We all know that, it doesn't undo. So I don't know if that really is the answer to your question, but.
No, it certainly, it does. It brings up so many points about mothering ourselves. And there's just a line from where you were just reading where you talked about the fact that you were not a very effective disciplinarian. Mm-hmm. And I also have struggled with that, less because of my parenting precisely, but because of the environment I grew up in, where I saw so much harshness and abuse of kids. How did you evolve in that way as your children aged and sort of tackle that demon of not necessarily going completely in the opposite direction?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And, I've said this for decades. My older daughter is 31 and was very headstrong, as sort of, presents itself in the book, really fiery. I mean, I must have read Adele Faber and Elaine Meslish, their book, Raising Your Spirited Child, like a million times, And Sophie was very spirited. The narrator in the book, refers to her sort of wild mare of a daughter. And I think that was a blessing for me, because had I ended up having 3 children, but I feel like having Sophie first gave me, I had to learn. This was a kid who would throw herself down in the middle of the floor in a grocery store, And so you're the parent, you're in charge. You have to figure out like how you get out of that grocery store. And so I had to learn what we didn't say triggers back then, but sort of like what her triggers were for one thing, so preventative stuff, but then also how to deal with things in the moment, because once her baby brother came along, then, she bit him too. So you can't allow that. So I simply had to, figure out how to, it's exactly what you said, Gina, except you saw it in your neighborhood, not inside your house. But my biggest fear was becoming, the example that I lived. And if I had like the easiest kid in the world, the one who just is super easygoing and you just kind of can do everything. And I don't think I would have learned the lessons that were probably really important for me to learn, not just as a mother, but as a human being.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about structure, because the structure of your book is really innovative, and it definitely, in my view, is a memoir. But there are all these questions out there, like what differentiates a memoir from from an essay collection. And for me, it feels like if the story forms an arc and it's all sort of part of one whole, I have the feeling of it being a memoir. Can you talk a little bit about how you made the choices to not only structure pieces as individual essays that stand on their own, but stylistically, like 4 dogs, maybe 5, like, how you told each different section differently?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for saying that it feels like a memoir to you, because that was really important to me. And it very much felt like that to me. And I very much wanted it to be that. And when I first got the publishing contract from Split Lip, they were describing it as an essay collection. And that just didn't click with me. I just thought, oh, I don't think that's what this is. Like, to me, this is a memoir. And for the exact reason that you said, even though it's fragmented and the structure is certainly non-traditional, it felt always to me like one story. And so as far as structure goes, and maybe the reason that you feel that, and I think that feedback has been pretty consistent. I think people are reading it as a memoir, even though it's, it's a fragmented structure, is because I did write I tried several different structures, including a more traditional narrative arc, a more traditional, unfragmented, right straight through, with a lot more connective tissue than is in the published version. And ultimately, as I talked about at Hippocamp, I also tried a fictionalized version of the story that had some scenes that didn't really happen, and to kind of, again, fill out that narrative arc. And when I settled on this structure, what I actually did is I went back to the form that some of these pieces were previously published, and I looked at what was working in them in the form that they were published in, and I realized that they could overlap in time with each other, and that not only could they do that, but that is actually what it was like to live it, right. That there was just this spiraling and cycling through the same experiences over and over again from a different vantage point in time. And once I stumbled upon that realization, I decided to fly it up the flagpole and see, if a publisher might agree with me, that elliptical or pendulum sort of structure could be effective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you just said, I teach Pam Houston's Corn Maze in almost every class I ever teach, even sometimes for fiction. And I think what you talked about in terms of like not experiencing time as linear, experiencing time kind of as a loop that we relive kind of spontaneously, everything in a sense triggers another thing. And, our memories are not linear and neat. And I think that's especially true with regard to trauma. So I thought it was a really effective way of telling your story and the way that kind of time overlaps. I also was thinking about the fact that when we write fiction, even if it's autobiographical fiction, we tend to be externalizing enough that we know we have to develop these characters because the reader doesn't see them exactly as we see them. Can you talk a little bit about the difference, since you are also a fiction writer, the difference between how to convey, your own mother, your stepmother, your sisters, your husband, your ex-husband, people who are real in your life? How much more difficult or easier or different was it to try to capture characters who are real people versus characters who are fictionalized, even when they're based on someone else? Was that a different experience for you?
Mm-hmm. Ooh, well, I've written, I do write fiction, although I've written more nonfiction than fiction. So almost like, the opposite proportion of, I think, what you would, because you're really a fiction writer and you've got novels out in the world. And, I have a few short stories and a novel in progress, but most of my body of work is nonfiction, but most of it until this collection, until the work that makes up this memoir, most was much less personal, much less, I think grounded in the principles of when I think of memoir, I think of it as much more similar to a novel than to, the kind of nonfiction we think of that's journalism or even just straight up essay. And which is another reason I wanted this book categorized as memoir. But so for building these characters, what was most important to me, there's two things that really mattered. And one was to be fair, and the second one was that they would feel real. I wanted them to feel like real, complex, full human beings. And in reality, those two things are really closely linked, because I think that, to achieve that requires a fairness. Like I needed to see all the sides of the characters. And, so with one exception, I think that the place I gave myself some leeway on that was with my stepfather, who is actually really one-dimensional in the book. And I decided to go ahead and let that was, and that was conscious and intentional, because that's true to my experience of my stepfather. There's one little place where I think the narrator is talking about him taking the two kids out to get it like something at Dairy Queen or something, and it's like, it's, this one little hint that maybe there was a moment, proportionally in the whole scheme of awful things that wasn't awful, but otherwise, yeah.
Right. And, that seems very realistic because it is ultimately from your lens. You are the subjective lens. And so it's a different way of treating character development than if this had been like third person editorial omniscience in a novel, right? Where, so you're being realistic to that experience. One of the things that I also love about this book is kind of the various echoes, like an echo chamber of mothers, surrogate mothers. And that I'm very drawn to the Eve storyline. I'm going to ask you to talk about that a bit. But for the moment, I also wanted to talk about the time you spent living with your father and stepmother, and the fact that when you told your mother about bad touch, which you had only learned had happened to you in a sense from hearing about it at school, that was where you became aware of bad touch, and you talked to your friend about it and say, do you think this counts? And she's like, yes. And so you end up telling people, and it gets around inside your family. And your stepmother, who you already feel doesn't like you, starts to like you less. And it seems as though there really just isn't any support for young Jeannine and what you've gone through, that everyone is sort of inconvenienced or agitated by this news. So why do you think that is such a common experience? And so I'll just say a little bit about why I'm asking this question. I worked for years with foster girls who had been taken out of their homes due to abuse. And it just seems so frequent that all the family members would end up aligning with the abuser. So do you think that's changed at all? Why do you think that is?
It's such an important and such a sad question. And I'll answer the personal part first and then, speculate on the broader implications. But in my case, I think that, when I think that my mother's reaction was what it was, in part because of what the narrator later learns, that she already knew, so it was like, here was this thing that had been, it's like, by the time the narrator busts out with this, like, hey, this thing happened, it had been years. My stepfather left when I was 10. And so, I think this was like, I was like 13 or something. So it must have been feeling to everybody like that was pretty much in the past. And it wasn't really ever, you know what I mean? Kind of like dodged that bullet. And I think that for my mom, it probably, she has a tendency to kind of like, freeze, I guess is the way to put it. And I think she just kind of like shut down. And my dad, this isn't in the book. I don't write about this. It didn't work. There wasn't a place for it. And also sometimes I feel like things just there's too much and it doesn't feel real anymore. But the narrator talks to her dad around that same time that confrontation happens with the mother. And he knew too. It comes out that he's like, oh yeah, kind of, we all knew that.
Wow.
Yeah. And I've talked to like cousins or on my mom's side of the family who are now in their like 50s and 60s and older than me. And they've said, oh yeah, we remember our parents talking about like, that Mike was, doing these things to you girls. And so the whole family system knew. And so I don't really know what to say about that, except that, what, people should protect kids. People should step in. And if you know something, and I get that people want to mind their own business and it's uncomfortable or like whatever. And I don't know, we were out in Wyoming and my mom's whole family was in Minnesota, in Duluth, Minnesota, like 1,000 miles away or whatever. I know that it was tricky and there's no sense. What's over is over, but I like to believe that I would behave very differently if I had knowledge that, you know, a child were being harmed. So, and why do, you know, I didn't feel, and then your second part of the question, why do, I know people align with the abuser. I didn't feel that people necessarily aligned with the abuser in my case. And I think looking back, it's in part because they knew that what I was saying was true. No one didn't believe me. It wasn't that. It wasn't that people thought I was lying. There was no accusation like that. I think what happened was that in the case of my stepmother, you know, she treated me as if I was now dangerous. And that was the most hurtful thing maybe that's ever happened to me in my life. And she no longer allowed me to be alone with my little sister, who was like, you know, 4 or so at the time. And there's a scene in the book that deals with that. And that was, you know, the most shame-inducing, you know, self-loathing inducing reaction I think that anyone could have had. Yeah, I can't really kind of think of much worse than that. And why do, you know, that's just another category. It's kind of almost worse than victim blaming. It's something else altogether. Right. And I'm sure there probably is a term for it in psychology. And now I've got my curiosity going and I want to learn more about this. But what is that when we turn the lens on someone, you know, who has been hurt and abused and say, oh, now you're dangerous? And I do know one thing about this is that it's incredibly rare for women who, if it even ever happens at all, who've experienced childhood sexual abuse to become abusers in that way. It just doesn't happen. But that's how she treated me. So,
yeah. No, I mean, it does seem, of course, we as a society talk a lot about, you know, oh, people who have been abused grow up to be abusers. That's not statistically true for women. And it's complex even for male children. It tends to be, I think, much more related, at least statistically, to witnessing one's mother being abused. And I remember when I worked at a battered women's agency, which was what it was called back in 1991, that being kind of an adage that, you know, you'd see your mother be abused your entire life and try to save her, and the futility of trying to save her, in a sense, you know, then leading to a greater statistical likelihood that you would have domestic violence in your home. And it does seem so sad. And so as someone who has broken that cycle and who even has collaboration from your daughter as a writer and so forth, I guess, what would you say in terms of people who are dealing with things like that in their own families, with regard to writing your way through something? There's so many people who are very afraid to write a story as kind of, I hate to use the word naked because any memoir is a curated piece, but do you feel that you were able to gain insight into other people through the process of writing the book because of that fundamental needing to be curious?
Yes, and I see that Dan's given us this is the last question warning, but I would just say that, yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a lot of transformation that comes out of that. You know, I think that I was with Lily Danziger over the weekend at the conference. And the idea, the way she put it is, when you take something that, you know, this grief or this wound that you've been carrying for a long time and make something out of it that's external to yourself, you know, it's lighter. It may not be entirely that you're not carrying it anymore, but you're definitely carrying it in a different way. And I think part of the reason why is what you talked about. It's that inquiry, you know, that really deep inquiry, both into the other people who you know, that you've experienced things with, but also inquiry into yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there are about 900 other questions I would love to ask you, but we will open it up if that's, I don't know. Dan told people to post in the Q&A, but I don't see anything. Dan, are there questions?
It looks like we don't have any questions, so I'm afraid we'll have to say goodnight. Thank you so much, Jeannine, for sharing your work and for the conversation. Thank you, Gina. Please buy the book. The link is in the chat. I want to thank our funders. Should be a slide here. Yes. A video of this reading and our previous readings will be on our website, wab.org, where you can also find upcoming readings. Thank you so much for coming, and have a good night.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Gina, and everyone.
Thank you for your book, Jeannine. Thank you, Dan, for hosting.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.